This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A very important topic today, the value of human life. My guest today, Howard Friedman, a leading statistician and health economist, teaches at Columbia. He has a new book, Ultimate Price, The Value We Place on Life. This is one of those books that causes me to pause because it's interesting as hell. The subtext is controversial, but it's super important for all of us to think about. Because the value of life often has a price tag on it, a monetary price tag. There's inequalities, there's unfairness. Things sometimes don't make any sense. People know there are problems because one group is treated one way and another group is treated another way. At a base level of humanity, none of us like that. We all want to believe in the idea that we're all equal. There's a certain fairness and that we're all valued the same. Now, of course, it gets more complicated than that. And this conversation is a great example of the complication. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Howard Friedman, talking about the value of human life. Right now, I don't think there could be any more interesting topic. Well, there's a lot of interesting topics in this world, but here you are, somebody who is looking at the value of human life. And now we have an example that everyone can relate to. And I know, for example, the virus is not part of your book, but your book is about valuing human life and jumping in with the current situation in the world as we talk on March 20th, 2020, which could be, gosh, for all I know, who knows what's going to unfold next. But I think this is a really unique time in terms of valuing human life because the way this is unfolding, you could look at a situation and say, well, gosh, some people are getting treated, others aren't getting treated. I mean, it opens up Pandora's box in terms of, again, the valuing of human life. And I mean, I'm sure you've been thinking about this nonstop.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. You're right. A lot of the concerns that people are raising are about inequity, which is about unfairness, and inequality, the unevenness. Certainly, I think we all understand that different countries are taking different approaches, but it certainly seems in some countries that those with the most privilege are able to get tests faster than those who don't. Obviously, we want to be concerned about that. As human beings, we have a certain sense of what is fair and what isn't fair.
When you say, well, gosh, some folks have got the tests and some folks don't. Clearly, Korea was prepared, and clearly our country, America, was not so prepared on the test front. I mean, there's a reason for that. I mean, for example, and this isn't really about the virus per se, but it's about a forward thinking. It's about taking a certain action. Then obviously we end up at this place where we're comparing places. It becomes a real conundrum. How do you start to unpack this when one particular country, perhaps forward thinking for an assortment of reasons, perhaps being in Asia, they could think back to the swine flu, they could think back to SARS, so they were more prepared. America had never experienced that, so they were less prepared. How do you start to unpack these kinds of things when you make comparisons?
It's really interesting because this question of cross-country comparisons has been a topic that I've been fascinated by for years. In fact, in 2012, I wrote a book called Measure of a Nation that compared different wealthy countries in terms of their health, education, safety, democracy, and equality. One of the things that was clear was that there are some countries that have really outstanding public health systems. Japan, for example. And there are others where it's quite far behind. For example, in the United States, the upshot of that book was that while we have the best let's say, advanced medicine, or some of the best in the world, some of the best, most advanced hospitals and medical schools, the public health system itself is lacking. There's also a very low return on investment. If you look at the amount Americans spend on health versus the outcomes, whether it's life expectancy and maternal mortality. There's this background issue that we start with, which I discuss a lot more in one of my previous books, Measure of a Nation, which is that the United States doesn't have the same level of public health that many of the other wealthy countries have.
Keep it at that point for a second, since you raise it. America is a country of 350 million people. Compared to many countries, America is much more diverse in terms of its different ethnic and racial groups. So 350 million people is it's a big number. We can all look at the financial statistics and we can say, well, gosh, so many Americans are kind of living on the edge. Maybe they maybe 50% of the country can't pull $1,000 together. How does one solve such a large issue like that? How do we even begin to wrap our arms around it? Because ultimately, it seems like, getting into your work right now, is the dollar comes into play here. The costs come into play, and valuing these things come into play. And it just seems like such a sticky wicket.
Well, first, I'm not familiar with the phrase sticky wickets. Let me step back a little bit. The first thing is I'm a numbers person. That's what I do. The United States, it has the largest population of any wealthy country. Wealthy defined by GDP per capita. It's a little difficult to compare. Its population isn't quite 350 million. It's probably a bit closer to maybe 330, but that's still much, much larger than the population of other wealthy countries, whether we talk about Japan or Germany or South Korea or the United Kingdom. There are some size issues that take place, but the other fundamental issue that you see in the United States is that we don't have the same level of social support. What it means is that the bottom can go much lower than in other countries. The bottom being healthcare, where we still have millions of people who have no health insurance, but also the bottom in terms of income. If you're earning a minimum wage in the United States, that would come out to about $15,000. It's extremely difficult to try and take care of yourself, let alone a family, when that's what you're earning. Of course, not only do we have, I'd say, a bottom that is much lower than other wealthy countries, but the top really goes higher. And the top in terms of income, where you have the CEOs of some companies earning hundreds of millions of dollars. You also have, like I described before, the top, the elite of the educational system is some of the best in the world. And the elite of the healthcare system are some of the best hospitals in the world. We have a country that is large in population. It also has a great range in terms of what people receive in terms of support and benefits, and ultimately how human life is valued.
Let's jump into a good example we could circle back on. I think as we're kind of where we are right now, we can get really, really, I don't want to say controversial, but we can kind of go off in different directions. But I think one of the things that catches my eye initially with your work, such a great example, was 9/11. And this is a classic example that you've got in your new work, The Ultimate Price. People might forget that post 9/11, a fund was put together, and that fund essentially dispersed money to victims. And I'll let you describe the dispersion, and I'll let you describe victims. There's been a lot of other events in America where people did not receive compensation. A lot of other horrific events where the kind of compensation that came out of 9/11 did not materialize for those people. 9/11 is a really interesting example in terms of valuing human life.
You're right. And your last point, which is probably one that makes the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund very controversial, is a lot of people didn't think it should exist in the first place. This was government money, taxpayer money. And the taxpayer money was allocated to victims. There was a special administrator, Kenneth Feinberg, who's probably the most famous arbitrator in the United States, who was tasked with allocating a large pool of money. And along the way, he had to come up with definitions of who were the victims, as well as come up with definitions of how much each person should receive. He was confined to a little bit of a constraint. And I shouldn't say little, actually, a big constraint, which is he should consider economics. And that means he has to reflect a little bit of what happens in civil court. Now, in the end, there were payments made to the families of those who died. And those payments ranged from a minimum of $250,000 to over $7 million. And what that means is that some lives were valued more than 30 times that of other lives. And most interestingly, the largest payout was for an injury, not a death. Now, you might ask a few questions. First one is, well, why 30 times more? The answer is income was playing a role. Those who earned more were deemed to be worth more in terms of the lost life. Now, Kenneth Feinberg did his best to limit that. There were people who were earning tremendous amounts of money. It was Wall Street, some of the deaths. But he capped the earnings so that there wouldn't be perhaps a payout of $50 million. He capped that earning. He also put a lower bound in. He said, no matter what, whoever you are, whatever you're earning, whatever your age is, the minimum amount would be $250,000, which is an interesting thing because we don't have a minimum amount in civil court. We could talk about it later, but there are examples where people died, no question about the negligence, but no payment was made. So you have this huge range, which had Kenneth Feinberg not tried to control it, it would have been much larger. And about that injury, well, why is it an injury worth more than death? Well, part of it was because there's no fundamental value for human life itself. He put something in the equation, that $250,000. But it's possible someone who's injured not only has a lifetime of lost income, but may also have a lifetime of medical expenses and care that's needed. So that was the calculation. And believe me, it's still controversial to this day. But Kenneth Feinberg had his own issues with it. And in fact, just a few years after he finished doing all that work, he said himself that it would have been simpler to administer and less controversial if everyone was paid the same amount.
What I love about that example is I think that example really defines the modern American political system and both views in a way. Not perfectly, but I think for some people listening, they're going to say, well, gosh, the original way that money was dispersed, that makes sense. One man was some high-level executive who was responsible for XYZ and brought in XYZ amount of dollars. We could look at his economic contribution. We could then look at another man, perhaps he was a fireman and we knew his salary, etc. Those comparisons people can make. Now, the other person might say, well, gosh, hold on. This they all died. Everyone died. Why are we favoring the rich guy, so to speak, first? Why does the rich guy get more money? You see where I'm going? It really does seem like this is a lot of the current political debate in America.
It is. And the truth is there's no perfect answer. You laid it out. You can make a good argument on either side. But at its core, my perception is that equity, that is fairness, and equality, evenness, should be the starting point. And maybe you need to make some deviations from there. But if you start with income, there's always going to be unfairness. Why? Because income has all these other things wrapped into it. We know about racial inequalities in income. We know about gender inequalities in income. We know about location inequalities, where depending on where you are, even if you do the same job function, you can get paid a very different amount of money. There are all these issues that start if you just use income. Now, if we take this further forward in time, are you familiar with the Boston Marathon bombing that happened? Another tragedy. This time, there were some differences in the situation. There was a bombing that happened. A fund was created. In that particular case, the fund came from private money. It wasn't government money. But there was a fund created and companies and individuals donated to try and help those who had been injured and the families of those who had been killed. The special administrator of that fund was also Kenneth Feinberg, the same person. Now, mind you, this is the bombing happening more than 10 years later. It happened in 2013. There were hundreds of injuries and there were deaths. What did he do? He valued all lives the same. the families of those who died received the same amount of money. His perspective, what he had concluded from the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, was exactly what he implemented with the Boston Marathon bombing. The results were far less controversial. There weren't tons of people complaining about the inequality in the payouts. I think people were satisfied. So maybe that hits, for most people, at a fairer conclusion. Now, it doesn't mean that all lives can always be valued the same. I don't like to try and equate the Nobel Peace Prize winner with the multiple homicide murderer. But I do want to at least start with the idea of equality, because I think that resonates with most people.
Yeah, I think at its root level, whether it's American or anyone around the world, fairness is a natural human instinct. I think people want to be fair. And then what comes after fairness is what starts to intrigue me, which is behavior. Okay, if we all agree, you know what, we're all born, damn it, it's fair, we're equal, we're the same. But at some point in time, behavior rears its ugly head. You might get two recent college graduates. One just decides, you know, I'm going to buckle down, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to work my rear end off. The other just says, oh my God, these bars that I was attending in college, they're even better after college. The weight pack's on, pre-diabetic by age 30 just because he's been screwing around for 6 or 7 years. This is the part that I think starts to become really interesting, is I think we can all agree that fairness, again, this is what we all want. This is what we all believe deep down. But what do you do when behavior rears its head?
Well, I think we have to talk about circumstances. We probably have to go away from the examples of September 11th and the Boston bombing, because in that case, no one's blaming the victims. It wasn't their lifestyles that caused them to die. I think you're moving into a different question, which is about situations where someone does have some ownership, some responsibility. So I think we need to separate that out from the conversations we were just having about the bombings. That said, I think that I hear this discussion in conversations about healthcare systems, where they say, what is the level of ownership of the person? And the reality is that health is a mix. It's a mix of genetics, it's a mix of lifestyle, it's a mix of luck. I think we have to understand that there isn't a perfect formula. Once again, we have to start with the idea of equality and work around it. I'll tell you a simple example from my own personal life. My best friend growing up was a tremendous athlete. He was a long-distance runner. He was in great shape. He ate well. And at age 25, he got a headache when he was playing softball. Fell down and never got back up. Died of an aneurysm. There was no personal responsibility. He didn't do anything wrong. The truth is the healthcare system may not have ever been able to help him out. They may not have ever been able to identify the aneurysm.
As we're talking, I'm drawing a bell curve on my paper here, and I'm thinking about the edges. I'm thinking about the outlier. I think we as humans, we all kind of know deep down that there could be a lightning strike. You or I could drop in the middle of this call from some unforeseen aneurysm. I mean, that could happen. But if we think more about, okay, the middle of that curve, and you're the much bigger stats guy than I am, I think sometimes I find these conversations really interesting is because we do end up focusing on the edges of the curve to extrapolate back to defend the middle. To me, it seems like, for example, if we look at something like obesity, we know that we can control for genetics, we can control for whatever else, but we know at the heart of it, America has an obesity problem because America has an eating problem. We can say, well, gosh, it's environmental. We can say, oh, someone's born into this circumstance. At some stage of the game, how do we get out of it if we can't go back to grandma ways of thinking, of looking at her 3 grandkids and 2 are skinny and one's eating all the pie all the time. And the grandma says, hey, stop eating that pie and stop getting fat. That's what a lot of this brings my mind back to, you know?
I guess headed back to cross-country comparisons, it's certainly true that U.S. life expectancy is lower than many other wealthy countries. No question. Some of that may be the genetic mix. When you do cross-country comparisons, it's quite difficult to control for that. But certainly U.S. has a higher obesity rate. But when you kind of start digging into the pieces of why the life expectancy is shorter, you don't get a single clear answer. Some of it really is due to the health system. Some of it may be due to the genetic mix. Some of it is certainly going to be due to lifestyle. What percentage is what? Honestly, I don't know, and I analyze data for a living. But I think I'm willing to certainly acknowledge that lifestyle plays a role, and I think everyone else would too. But we have other issues that are going on that make it a challenge in the United States. So it's not just lifestyle. Case in point would be there are substantial differences in the life expectancy as a function of race, with Hispanics on average living longer than many other groups, Black Americans having much shorter life expectancies. Now, of course, the bigger picture that you're probably aware of is the U.S. is one of the very few countries that has seen its life expectancy decline year over year for, I believe now, 3 straight years. We have some systematic issues that are going on that we need to address.
Let me let you run with that a little bit. What types of systematic issues come to mind for you?
Well, it's been pretty well documented that the opioid crisis is a major issue that's impacting life expectancy. I do think back to one of our opening points, which was the public health system is comparatively weak versus other countries, and that plays a strong role. I think that lifestyle will certainly play into it as well. But I think piece by piece, we have to address them. In the short term, I think a lot of people have identified that things such as the opioid crisis are playing a substantial role in the shortening of many people's life expectancies.
Not my path in our conversation, in the sense that
not my path either.
I don't want to keep you going down a tangent or a certain direction that kind of gets us away from things. But I think it is interesting. I think the audience can see it. There is definitely 2 people in this conversation, you and I, pushing back on issues. And there's 2 distinct points of view. I think those distinct points of view are representative of 2 larger distinct points of view in America. And I don't think there is, so far as I can see, a meeting point. Look, I've got a cousin who died of opioid abuse. When I think of him, I think often of the decisions he made, the behavior that he caused for family and whatnot. Yes, there is some sympathy, some empathy for him getting addicted and whatnot, but there's also a decent amount of anger. It gets back to how much personal responsibility is involved in a lot of these issues and how much is not. I think that becomes the rub for a lot of these issues across the American conversation.
I think you're right. There is a balance, and there's probably, to me, it's a question of how much is allocated to one area versus another. I don't think it's a yes-no. I don't think it's a personal decision versus a public health. I think all these factors play in. I don't think you can separate them all out that simply.
Let me shift you into one that you might not be expecting, getting away from the American conversation, but getting right into the heart of valuing a human life. So in the last 7 or 8 years, I've had a good chance to spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia, a good chance to spend a lot of time in Vietnam. Before I came to Vietnam, look, as a guy who grew up in high school in the 80s, Rambo movies, all of the Vietnam War movies, I lived outside the Washington, D.C. area. I was there for the entire debate, the contest of how the Vietnam Memorial would be built on the mall in Washington, D.C. I remember hearing about the lady that won it. I've seen it. I've gone down and I've looked at it since I've lived in Vietnam. I don't think I ever saw it before, even though I lived in the area. If you go down and you ask a park ranger standing at that wall, how many Americans are inscribed on this wall? And the park ranger will say, I think it's about 58,000, roughly is the number. If I ask that park ranger, hey, does it say anywhere here how many people we killed in Vietnam? Boy, you've never seen a park ranger run faster away from me. I'm telling you what, just like, and the answer was no. Now, and I think your book describes the figure of the number of people that we killed. I think I looked it up as 1 million. I think a lot of people would describe that number as much higher, perhaps even 3 or 4 million. Any way we go, it's off the charts. The reason I do all of this layout, I do not think the vast majority of Americans who know the story of the Vietnam War, what the Vietnamese call the American War, know how many people we killed. When you look at the consternation and you look at the internal debates America had and the whole notion of building the memorial, talking about that number to where just a lot of people of a certain age just know that number, 58,000, and have no clue the other side of the ledger. I open up your book and it's all about the value of human life. And it's like, boy, you talk about inequality. There's an inequality right there that just is not fathomable.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I love that you're laying this out. This is something that bothers me as well. And I do explicitly discuss it in the book. Quick aside, I've been to Vietnam a number of times. Tremendous admiration for the culture. Certainly think highly of everything that they've done to progress. In my book, I specifically talk about this because I think it's important. We think about the nearly 60,000 American soldiers killed and MIA POW campaigns that continue even to today. You're right, there is this amazing memorial. And I lived in D.C. for 5 years, and I visited those areas very frequently. But I talk about it in the book, and what I specifically say is what is rarely ever mentioned are the 1 million or more Vietnamese deaths associated with the war. I appreciate it, and I discuss it really in the book, that from the perspective of an American, they value the lives of American soldiers, I think, more than the lives of the Vietnamese that were lost.
When you say they, you mean America itself?
Americans, it's a human nature thing. We all have in-groups, and our in-groups are defined by whether it's families and friends, and it can get larger to religion, it can get larger to our country. But the more we associate with someone, the more we value their life. And value in this case isn't about dollars and cents necessarily. It's more a measure of how much we care, how much we're concerned, how much we spend of our time. Time often is equated to money. So I always say, when you want to look at someone's values, look at how they allocate their time and their money. In this particular case, I think that you're right, that you would get some strange reactions from some people if you asked, hey, what about the 1 million or more Vietnamese deaths? Because it's not top of mind. We're of about the same age, Michael. We grew up around the same time. We had the same exposure to the education. And I think we were both privileged to be able to travel around the world and see the perspective of other people. And that's something that I try to always bring into my books. Measure of a Nation, a lot of the purpose of that book was to raise people's awareness, Americans' awareness of the fact that other countries do things differently. Sometimes that might be better. And in this book, I focus originally on the United States, but then I broaden the conversation to talk about the fact that we do have these influences, and we sometimes value one set of lives much more than others because we associate more with them. And nationalism is just a good example.
Yeah, I think I've got a superpower living outside of the States for a while, because if we look at the beginning of our conversation, we are having this kind of American-centric view inside the borders. And so if anyone's inside the borders, they get the benefit of being called an American. So then we're having an inequality conversation about America. It kind of ignores the rest of the world. But then when you spend time outside America and you look at the way that people that might have far less means than America has, have no safety net, no kind of welfare benefits or anything, and they pretty much know they've got to hustle or they don't eat. They got to hustle or they don't survive. And I think if you want to kind of unpack some of my pushback on the initial part of our conversation, it's that. Because I just don't have the sympathy anymore. Because I've seen how people, because we're all the same again. That's the whole point. We're all human. And so I've seen how people outside of the borders of the United States of America behave when they don't have nearly anywhere close to the benefits or advantages. And that gets me really ticked off about the behaviors in America.
Okay. I think that's more your statement than really a question.
Well, no, it's open topic for conversation, because I think ultimately that's why I bring up Vietnam, even in the war deaths and whatnot, is because if we're going to value human life, it's borderless, isn't it, ultimately?
Well, that's the interesting thing. When we talk about regulations, environmental regulations, I talk in the book about how I think it should be borderless, that when we look at the costs of changing environmental regulations and the value of the lives saved, that we should be looking at the value across the borders, not just American lives. But that's not always the case. When we talk about wars, I get into this in the latter part of the book, there's always an asymmetry in the perspective that people tend to have. They look at their country first and they don't focus on the other countries. We talked about Vietnam, but this comes up time and time again in any discussion of wars. Ultimately, we would like to think that we take a global view. And I think it's important to consider that. But it's not necessarily human nature to do that. It's natural for you to focus on those you know best, your family, your friends first. It's natural for you to want to connect more with people who often you have more similarities with, whether that's religion, culture, language. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but many human beings act that way. When I discuss in my book about valuing human life, it's written from an American point of view. I focus a lot about the United States, but I do try to emphasize the idea that we should have a global perspective. We should be thinking about all of human life, not just Americans. I think that's a principle that I emphasize in the book, but we have to recognize that there's a natural tendency for people to not do that. Not all people, I should qualify that, for many people to not take that global perspective.
It's always good, too, for America to remember what America is. It's a melting pot. You can come back to me and say, Mike, this is not a question, this is your belief. But America is a melting pot. It's a diverse place. That's often been held out as a badge of honor, so to speak, in America. Sometimes when you spend time outside the States and you look at the rest of the world, most other countries are pretty homogenous. And sometimes you travel other countries, you're like, gosh, everyone's kind of like a brother and sister. And that becomes one of their advantages. That's one of their unique advantages, I think, for most other countries besides America, the great experiment with America. I think sometimes we talk about some of the arguments and the value of the arguments about placing value on life in America. Perhaps it's because it is so tribal. We've got all these different tribes, all these different families and friends that are not really friends and family with the other friends and family, just because of the nature of humanity, the way we've evolved with all these different groups around the world.
I do think that some of the strength of the United States is its diversity, the ethnic diversity, the religious diversity, but many other countries do have diversity. And sometimes the diversity is a little more subtle for someone from the outside. You're in Vietnam. So Vietnam, of course, has different ethnic groups. And many people think of Vietnam, they think of the Kin population. Well, that's certainly the majority of the population, but there are other ethnic groups there. There is diversity in terms of language and culture. But if you take other countries, they also have a diversity to them. It's a diversity that often as a foreigner we don't see. China has a great diversity in terms of ethnic groups and in terms of their different dialects. And those dialects, they are very difficult for one person speaking one dialect to understand another dialect. There is diversity. It's just not the diversity that is so obvious to us. So I think that the United States does have a strength in its more very transparent ethnic diversities and religious diversity and the perspectives of the people. But there are other immigrant countries. Countries, when I say immigrant countries, that are people, the vast majority can trace their descendants from other countries going back just a few generations. So it's not a unique experiment in that sense. It's a large country, but it does have experiences that can be compared to other countries. That's really one of the things that I try to do in all of my writing, is to talk about the fact that there are other countries out there that have other challenges that are similar. There may be good opportunities to learn from those other countries.
Let me bring you back to something we started the conversation off with, which is the virus that's going across the world right now. One of the interesting values that one would place on human life is taking place, or has been taking place, for months, first starting in China, now into Italy. Doctors are having to make decisions, really, really tough decisions, about who to treat due to a scarcity of manpower and resources. That's a really, really difficult one, because in many ways, there's not really time to examine the economics or think about the economics. It's really somewhat biased towards in the moment decisions about who we think has a better chance to survive. But look, if you're alive at that moment in time, everyone's equal.
If we step back a bit, health systems have traditionally had different metrics that they use to prioritize their resources because every health system does have limited resources. During an epidemic, the issues become more acute. You do have to start thinking about how to ration your services, but you're rationing services all the time. The prioritization of who gets the most services or the most care is a healthcare decision. Sometimes people look at different metrics, and the metric matters. Some people look, for example, at the cost per life saved. How much do I have to spend to save a life? Some look at the cost per life year saved. The difference being I'm looking at not just do I save the life, but also what is the life expectancy of that person if they are able to survive this issue. Some people add on top of it the cost per quality adjusted life year or disability adjusted life year. These are decisions that are made often by the public health system. So branches of the government use different metrics. The metric that's chosen impacts whose life gets saved and who doesn't. I try in Ultimate Price to walk through some examples so people can understand that choose a different metric, you'll save a different life. But your statement was more about the fact that right now, in these acute conditions, doctors have to make immediate decisions. It's a very stressful time. It's true that they're making these decisions. But the other thing I want to recognize is those on the healthcare lines, the doctors, the nurses, the midwives, they're constantly being exposed to these viruses. The risks that they take and the sacrifices they're making are only now being appreciated in times of crisis.
Let me shift you to a criminal justice perspective for a second. Let's unpack this some. Michael Bloomberg was all the topic for a period of time and while he was running for president, and he caught a lot of flack for one of his policies that involves stopping young guys. And if there's a better way to describe it, feel free when you take over here. But stopping young guys that may or may not have been up to no good and basically shaking them down and stopping frisk and as a way to try and lower crime. My understanding is it worked to some degree, perhaps in a very measurable way. I think the way that I've seen Michael Bloomberg describe it is it worked for a very measurable way, and then maybe they started doing it too much and it stopped working. I haven't looked at the raw data, but apparently people believe that this policy did work for a period of time. But obviously politically, once he started running, this was not a very good thing to have on your resume. What do you think about this perspective? Because I think crime in America is so interesting in the sense that everyone talks about it. Everyone talks about crime. People talk about guns. We talk about homicides. But, going back to high school, everyone knows that in inner city America, and it hasn't really changed over the course of my lifetime, 50% of gun homicides, gun deaths, 50% is coming from roughly 6% of the population. It's coming from black guys that are killing each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why you can't get it solved, is no one seems to care because it just hasn't changed at all. So this segment of the population is killing each other and no one cares. And it just keeps going and going and going. I cannot believe I'm sitting here 30 years later and it's the same conversation with no change.
So I'll comment on stop and frisk and leave it at that. So for stop and frisk, it was controversial because of the implementation and the fact that it looked to have been racially targeting, which is illegal, period. But the bigger question that a lot of people have is, did it actually have any impact on crime? It's not clear that it did at all. Specifically, there are not only some studies that show no evidence that it was effective, but stop and frisk was vastly, vastly reduced when Mayor de Blasio was elected. It went from a pervasive program to a very, very small program in terms of orders of magnitude. Did the homicide rate explode? Did it jump back up once the program was vastly reduced? No. There's a method of program evaluation that's called remove treatment. Remove treatment is you apply the program, look for an impact, remove the program, and see if the issue reverts. Does it come back? In the case of stop and frisk, many other cities saw dramatic declines in crime at the same time that New York City saw declines. It wasn't only New York City and its stop and frisk program that saw the declines in these major crimes. So we had a nationwide trend in the vast majority of major cities. Not every major city, but the vast majority happened at the same time. And then when stop and frisk was basically vastly curtailed when Mayor de Blasio took over, crime did not explode. It didn't jump back up. Basically, there's not great evidence that it actually had any impact, but it's quite clear that it had a lot of racial biases in its implementation. So that's the reality, as I know it, of the data for stop and frisk.
Can I ask, what about the second part of what I said caused you discomfort?
I'm uncomfortable with the way you framed it, and I'm not really going to comment on it or support it.
How would you change it?
Honestly, Michael, I'm not going to pursue or comment down that road. Thank you.
I'm not trying to be controversial here. I'm literally trying to find out. I mean, I don't think I said anything that was off on any kind of a tangent. This is honestly one of the first times I think I've been doing this having conversations for 7 or 8 years. I don't recall a time where I said something that somebody said, well, gosh, you're completely off your rocker. I'm just trying to wrap my arms around it.
To me, a lot of it came across as racist. May not be, but that's how it came across to me. I don't want to pursue that line of discussion.
Just to keep it so we can at least end on some kind of a nice note, I went ahead and mentioned statistics that are known statistics. We know that our inner cities have major problems that haven't been fixed. Everyone wants them fixed. I just want to try to understand what it is that I said that would cause you to think that it was racist.
I really don't want to pursue this conversation further, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to have an interview with you, but I don't want to pursue this further. Thank you.
Well, I will leave it there. It's the first time in the history of this conversation that I've been accused of being a racist. I'm disappointed that you can't go ahead and have a conversation about it. I'm disappointed because this is the reason why America has trouble right now, because nobody can have an honest conversation. You and I know what the gun death statistics are. I mentioned them, and that's racism. That's insane. You know it's insane, and I know it's insane. That's just not correct or fair.
I'm happy to have a conversation about how human life is valued, if that's what you'd like to have. I don't want to pursue this avenue of discussion.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the end. The most epic ending of one of my podcast episodes ever. I can only think of the famous line from Anchorman with Will Ferrell.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Right? You got to start laughing to yourself, right? That was a serious escalation. Now, in all fairness, it was kind of building the whole conversation. I was biting my tongue to some degree. But I do want you to check out Howard's book, Ultimate Price, The Value We Place on Life. It is a great topic opener. Look at what happened to us on this conversation. These are the kinds of conversations that need to be had. And I give Howard credit for starting them. Now, I wish he would have finished it with me, but hey, that's life. Sometimes shit happens. I want to tell a little story to end, because it's no fun when someone accuses you of being something when you're not. Back when I was 19, I worked in the warehouse at Circuit City, an electronics store. It was me in the warehouse with 4 black guys. I don't remember their names. One was Joe, one was Steve. Now, at the time, I was a pretty big guy. I was lifting a lot of weights. I could easily bench press over 300 pounds. I was 6 foot tall. One of the guys was about my size, but not very strong. Another guy was kind of short and chubby. Another guy looked like a 5'10" running back, just a brick shithouse. Probably would have kicked my butt in a heartbeat. And the other guy was 6'5", 245 pounds, and was an all-Met football player for T.C. Williams. Now, I can't remember the exact year he would have been that good of a football player, but he was so damn strong. And the five of us would be in the warehouse. I mean, literally throwing TVs around because they were in these huge boxes, you know? It was just a blast. And it was my first opportunity in life to really be in this environment with four black guys from an entirely different world. Because look, I grew up in the suburbs. Most guys in the suburbs, most white guys in the suburbs, let's face it, America is separated. So I had this fun chance to be in the warehouse with all these guys. And they wanted to, test me. We often would kind of slam each other into boxes and throw things around. I mean, it was crazy. But I remember the one guy, the big guy. We were all screwing around one day. And he picked me up by my ankle, one arm, and held me upside down. Now, I was 6 foot tall, probably about 205 pounds. He picked me up by my ankle and held me upside down like I was a rag doll. It was the craziest damn experience. Now, I'm sure there's some ladies listening where somebody has joked around and held them upside down or something like that. But for most men of size, that doesn't happen any time in your life. Now, to tell you that story is not to virtue signal and to show you that I'm some cool guy and I'm all connected. But it is to share a moment in my life. Now, the sad part, the really sad part, is probably like 10 years later. I was walking through a mall in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, and that's where the Circuit City was located at the time. And one of the salespeople at Circuit City stopped me, recognized me, and we started chatting. And he said, "Hey, did you hear about such and such?" This was the big guy's name. And I said, "No, I remember him, but no, I don't know what happened." And he got into drug dealing. And one time he was in a car with his buddy, parked at a stoplight, and not unlike a scene out of Breaking Bad, a car pulled in front, a car pulled behind, guys got out with machine guns and put hundreds of bullets into my friend who held me upside down that one time so many years ago. So why do I tell you that story? Well, it gets back to what I was telling Howard. 12 to 14,000 people per year in America die from gun deaths, homicides. 50% or more are black guys killing black guys. And black guys only make up 6% of the population. So 6% of the population is responsible for 50% of the gun deaths. That's not a racist statement. It's not a racist argument. It's a fact. And if we are going to solve the problem of the violence that exists in inner city America, if we're going to start to understand the value of human life, we have to understand where the problem is. It's not just everybody. Think back to the conversation I had with Howard. I brought up Vietnam. I talked about the unfairness of how America fixates on the 58,000 soldiers it lost, but ignores the millions of Vietnamese it killed, it being America. I'm sure you could feel it in the conversation. There was a great difference of opinion between Howard and I on behavior. For us to solve some of our greatest problems, for us to value life in a better way, it starts with honestly acknowledging where the problems are. And so before I could even get into a criminal justice inequality conversation about the valuing of human life, my predicate, a factual predicate based on statistics, caused Howard to blink, caused him to be upset. And that's unfortunate. Now, before I could connect back with him, he wrote me an email and he said, "Michael, I regret that the interview that I think started well ended poorly. I wish you the best of luck with your show and thank you for the opportunity you gave me to speak with you. Best wishes, Howard." Now, you might imagine I was a little bit hot at the moment still, and I gave it a little time to breathe, and I spoke with his representative. And I wrote him an email back. Hi, Howard. Some feedback. Number one, you wanted to control the content of the conversation from the outset. It doesn't work that way. A side tangent, what I mean there, at the very beginning, Howard said there were some topics off limits, which no one ever tells me. Subconsciously, perhaps that triggered the 60 Minutes insider interviewer in my mind. Number two, you have a very interesting and controversial topic, but it's not a topic that exists only in one partisan corner. I have friends and family across the political spectrum. My guests cover the political spectrum. Number three, race and crime are not new topics, and I gave him two very public links about race and crime, the statistics of it. And I concluded with him, a much better path would have been to walk into the controversy that you thought you perceived from me and find common ground, and not to immediately assume I'm some loose cannon. Best, Mike. Now, again, I really think that Howard does a good job in his book of bringing up a very important topic, the value we place on life. But the value we place on life is just that, complicated. And I was the person who was setting forward some of the complicated issues about how and why the value of life gets complicated. And running away from these issues, not addressing them head on, that doesn't get us to a better understanding. So I apologize to anyone and everyone if you were possibly offended like Howard was. But I'm a data guy too. And I know what the statistics say. And I don't like the fact that America has a problem, a big problem, in inner cities that's ignored. It's not fixed. It's not solved. And no one seems to care. And that was the predicate of even getting into the conversation. And if we can't even put the data on the table, how in the world can we find common ground? I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.